Welcome to Godless and Grounded.
Imagine for a moment that you are standing in a vast, dark field thousands of years ago. The sun has just dipped below the horizon, and the sky is a deep, terrifying purple. Suddenly, a jagged bolt of white light tears through the clouds, followed by a roar so loud it shakes the very ground beneath your feet. You have no concept of atmospheric pressure, static electricity, or the speed of sound. To you, that isn't a meteorological event. It is a voice. It is the anger of a giant, invisible being who lives in the clouds. This is the starting point of the human story. We have always been a species that hates a vacuum. We cannot stand not knowing. When we hit a wall in our understanding, we don't like to sit in the silence of I don't know. Instead, we reach for a placeholder. We reach for a god. This phenomenon is what philosophers and scientists call the god of the gaps. It is the habit of sticking a divine explanation into the holes of our current scientific knowledge. But there is a massive problem for religion here. As our knowledge grows, those holes get smaller. Every time we learn how something actually works, the space where a god can hide shrinks just a little bit more. Think about the ancient Greeks. For them, the sun didn't move because of orbital mechanics or gravity. It moved because Helios pulled it across the sky in a golden chariot. When the tides came in and out, it wasn't the gravitational pull of the moon. It was the mood of Poseidon. These weren't just metaphors to them. They were literal explanations for how the physical world operated. But as we began to understand the laws of physics, Helios was forced to retire. Poseidon was evicted from the oceans. This is the repeating pattern of history. Religion starts with a huge amount of territory. It claims to explain everything from why it rains to why we get sick. But then, science enters the room. Science starts planting flags of understanding, and every time it does, religion has to pack its bags and move further back into the shadows of the unknown. Take the example of disease. For the vast majority of human history, a plague was seen as a divine punishment. If a village was wiped out by a fever, people didn't look for dirty water or fleas. They looked for who had sinned. They prayed, they performed rituals, and they sacrificed animals to appease a god they thought was angry. Then came the germ theory of disease. We discovered bacteria and viruses. We realized that invisible microorganisms, not invisible deities, were the cause of our suffering. The gap that God occupied in the medical world vanished. We didn't need a supernatural explanation for polio or smallpox anymore, because we had a biological one. Today, when you get a cold, you don't go to a priest to ask which commandment you broke. You take an aspirin and rest. The divine explanation has been replaced by a functional, provable reality. This shift happens over and over again. We used to think the Earth was the center of the universe because holy texts suggested we were the focus of a creator's attention. Then Copernicus and Galileo showed up. They showed that we are just one planet circling a star, which is just one star among billions in a galaxy that is just one of trillions. The gap of human central importance started to close. Then came Charles Darwin. Before Darwin, the complexity of life was the ultimate gotcha for religion. How could something as complex as a human eye or a bird's wing just happen? It had to be a designer. It was the biggest gap of all. But Darwin showed that you don't need a designer if you have enough time and the process of natural selection. Complexity can emerge from simplicity through a blind, unguided process. Suddenly, the biggest piece of real estate God owned, the creation of life, was taken over by biology. The problem with building a faith on these gaps is that it puts God on a losing streak. If you define God as the cause of things we don't yet understand, then God becomes a disappearing act. You are basically saying that God is a name for our ignorance. As we become less ignorant, your God gets smaller. It is a very dangerous way to set up a worldview because it makes science the enemy of your faith. Every time a scientist makes a breakthrough, a piece of that religion dies. We see this today with things like the Big Bang or the origin of consciousness. Because we don't have every single answer about how the universe began or how neurons create a sense of self. People jump in and say, "See? That must be God." But they said the same thing about lightning. They said the same thing about the rainbow. They said the same thing about the heartbeat. Why would we assume that the gaps we have today won't be filled tomorrow? Let's look at the logic of this. The God of the gaps argument is essentially a logical fallacy called an argument from ignorance. It follows a simple but flawed path. I don't know how X happened, therefore God did X. But not knowing the answer to a question doesn't mean you get to invent an answer. If you're looking at a magic trick and you can't figure out how the magician made the coin disappear, you don't assume he actually used real magic and broke the laws of physics. You just admit you don't know the trick yet. Religion, however, insists that the trick is real magic every single time, right up until the moment the secret is revealed. And once the secret is out, the religious explanation never comes back. You never see a scientific explanation get debunked by a supernatural one. We never found out that a disease we thought was a virus was actually a demon. It's always a one-way street moving away from the supernatural toward the natural. Even the way we talk about laws of nature shows how much ground has been lost. In the past, laws were seen as commands given by a ruler. The universe obeyed because it had to follow God's orders. But in modern science, a law is just a description of how things work consistently. Gravity isn't a command. It's a property of mass and space-time. We don't need a lawmaker to keep the planets in orbit any more than we need a driver to keep a ball rolling down a hill. The mechanical nature of the universe is so consistent that it leaves no room for a divine hand to reach in and tweak things. If a God does exist, he seems to have designed a system that functions perfectly well without his interference, which raises the question, why bother with the God hypothesis at all? As the French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace famously told Napoleon when asked why he hadn't mentioned a creator in his work on celestial mechanics, "I had no need of that hypothesis." We can also look at the history of disasters. For centuries, earthquakes and volcanoes were considered acts of God. They were signs of his displeasure or upcoming judgment. Now, we have plate tectonics. We know about magma chambers and pressure points in the Earth's crust. We can predict when a volcano might blow and measure the magnitude of a quake. The gap of geological terror has been filled with geology. The same goes for mental health. What we used to call demonic possession, we now call epilepsy, schizophrenia, or Tourette's syndrome. We use medication and therapy instead of exorcisms. Every time we replace a spirit with a synapse, the realm of the divine shrinks. Religion is essentially being pushed into the smallest corners of existence. It used to own the stars, the earth, the animals, and the human body. Now, it is mostly relegated to the very beginning of the universe, the first trillionth of a second, and the moments after we die. It's hanging out in the places where science hasn't fully set up its cameras yet. But if history is any indicator, those cameras are being built. We are learning more about quantum cosmology and the nature of time. We are learning more about the process of death and the brain. The gaps are closing, and they are closing faster than ever before. What happens to a religion when there are no gaps left? What happens when the unknown is no longer a dark forest but a well-mapped map? We are seeing the answer in the rise of secularism. When people realize they don't need a god to explain the rain, the harvest, their health, or the stars, the social necessity of religion begins to crumble. It becomes a hobby or a cultural tradition, rather than a source of truth. The god of the gaps is a god of a shrinking empire. He is a king who loses a province every time a telescope is pointed at the sky or a microscope is focused on a cell. The most interesting part of this is how religious language changes to try and keep up. When science proves a holy book wrong, the followers often stop taking that part of the book literally. It becomes a metaphor or a poetic expression. Genesis was literal truth until geology and evolution made that impossible. Then it became an allegory. This is a survival tactic. It is an attempt to move the goalposts so that God can stay in the gaps, even as those gaps move. But you can only move the goalposts so many times before you're off the field entirely. If you base your sense of wonder on what we don't know, your wonder is based on a lack of information. But if you base your wonder on what we do know, the world becomes even more incredible. You don't need a god to make a sunset beautiful. The physics of light scattering through the atmosphere is beautiful enough on its own. You don't need a creator to make life meaningful. The fact that we are a way for the universe to know itself, through billions of years of cosmic and biological evolution, is far more profound than any ancient myth. The shrinking of religion isn't a loss for humanity. It is the story of our adulthood. We are finally stopping the habit of blaming the shadows for the noise and starting to turn on the lights. When you talk to someone about this, they will eventually point to the Big Bang. They will say, okay, maybe we understand evolution and weather, but what about the very beginning? What caused the first spark? This is the final fortress for the god of the gaps. It is the first cause argument. But even here, the walls are closing in. In the past, people thought the universe was static and eternal, or that it was created in a week. Then we discovered cosmic microwave background radiation, which gave us a literal echo of the Big Bang. Now, physicists are working on models of quantum gravity and string theory that suggest the universe could have come from a quantum fluctuation, a nothing, that is actually a something governed by physical laws. We see a similar retreat in the study of the human mind. For centuries, the soul was the gap. People argued that while the body might be a machine, the spark of consciousness, our personality, and our will had to be divine. It was the ghost in the machine. But neuroscience is slowly evicting that ghost. We can now see exactly which parts of the brain light up when you feel love, when you make a decision, or when you have a religious experience. We know that if you damage a specific part of the physical brain, the person's character can change entirely. If the soul is what makes you you, but a physical injury can change your you, then what is the soul actually doing? The gap of the soul is being filled by the map of the brain. Think about the concept of morality. This was always a major religious gap. The argument was that without a God to give us a list of rules, we would all be monsters. Religion claimed ownership over good and evil. But then we started looking at evolutionary biology and primatology. We found that empathy, cooperation, and fairness aren't divine commands dropped from the clouds. They are survival strategies. Animals like chimpanzees and elephants show signs of grief, altruism, and fairness. They don't have Bibles or temples, yet they have a moral structure because it helps the group survive. The gap where God used to be the only source of goodness has been replaced by a much more grounded understanding of social evolution. We are good because being good worked for our ancestors. The most fascinating thing about the God of the gaps is that it actually makes God look quite incompetent. If God only exists where our knowledge doesn't, then God is essentially a loser in the game of history. He is like a fugitive running from the light of a flashlight. Every time the light gets brighter or moves further into the room, he has to scurry under the bed or into the closet. If you were a believer, wouldn't you want a God who is found in what we do understand, rather than what we don't? By pinning their faith on the unknown, religious people are betting against human progress. They are put in a position where they have to hope that science fails, because if science succeeds, their version of God disappears. Let's look at the argument of fine-tuning. This is a popular modern gap. People say that the constants of physics, like the strength of gravity or the expansion rate of the universe, are so perfectly set that if they were off by a tiny fraction, life couldn't exist. God must have turned the dials, they say. But this is just another gap. It assumes that because we don't yet have a theory of everything to explain why these constants are what they are, the only answer is a designer. But we've been here before. We thought the fine-tuning of the solar system was proof of God until we realized there are billions of planets, and we just happen to be on the one that can support life. We didn't win the cosmic lottery because someone rigged the machine. We are just the people holding the winning ticket in a game with trillions of players. Another example is the origin of life, or abiogenesis. This is often cited as a gap that science can never bridge. People ask, how does dead matter become a living cell? Because we haven't recreated that exact moment in a lab yet, they claim God is the only answer. But we've already found the building blocks of life in meteorites and deep-sea vents. We've seen how simple chemicals can form complex chains. We are moving from it's a miracle to it's a very difficult chemistry problem. When that problem is finally solved, the life-giver God will have to move again, just like the weather-maker God did. The history of science is a graveyard of dead gods. Thousands of years ago, there were gods for the harvest, gods for fertility, gods for the wind, and gods for fire. Where are they now? They didn't die because people stopped believing in them for no reason. They died because they became redundant. We found better, more reliable ways to explain the world. We realized that a tractor and fertilizer grow more food than a sacrifice ever did. We realized that a weather satellite is more useful than a prayer for rain. As the utility of God disappears, the belief in God follows. This is why the reaction to scientific discovery is often so hostile from religious institutions. They know, on some level, that this is a zero-sum game. The more we explain, the less they have to do. If the universe is a self-sustaining machine that follows its own rules, the manager of that machine becomes unemployed. This is also why many modern religious movements try to scienceify their language. They talk about intelligent design or quantum spirituality. They are trying to reclaim the territory science has taken by using its own vocabulary. But it's a hollow attempt. It's still just the same old god of the gaps, just wearing a lab coat. We have to ask ourselves, why do we keep doing this? Why do we keep trying to fit a deity into the corners of our ignorance? It's because the gaps are scary. Admitting we don't know how the universe started or exactly what happens to our consciousness when we die is uncomfortable. It leaves us feeling small and vulnerable. Religion provides a security blanket by filling those gaps with a parental figure. But there is a massive difference between a comfortable lie and a difficult truth. Choosing to live without the god of the gaps means accepting the unknown. It means being okay with the fact that there are pages of the book of nature that haven't been read yet. But that's the excitement of being alive. If we already had all the answers, if God did it was the answer to every difficult question, there would be no reason to explore, to test, or to learn. The god of the gaps is a conversation stopper. Science is a conversation starter. When we look at the shrinking map of religion, we shouldn't see it as a tragedy. We should see it as a victory for the human mind. We are moving away from a world where we were victims of mysterious, invisible forces, and moving toward a world where we understand our environment and ourselves. We are trading the magic of the ancient world for the miracles of modern medicine, technology, and understanding. So the next time you hear someone say that science can't explain everything, just remember the lightning bolt. Remember the plague. Remember the chariot of the sun. Those were all unexplainable once. The God that lives in our ignorance is a temporary tenant. He's always just one discovery away from being evicted. The universe is vast, and our knowledge is a small light in the darkness. But that light is growing, and as it grows, the shadows where the old gods lived are disappearing. We don't need to be afraid of the shrinking gap. We should be proud of the growing light. One of the most interesting ways religion tries to survive this shrinking process is by moving from the physical world into the abstract world of why. When science explains how a star forms or how a heart beats, some people pivot and say that science only handles the mechanics, while God handles the purpose. As we study sociology, psychology, and even animal behavior, we find that purpose isn't a magical substance handed down from a creator. It is a human construct. We create purpose through our relationships, our work, and our contribution to the world around us. By assigning the why to a deity, we actually rob ourselves of the credit for building meaningful lives. But as we step into those roles ourselves, the mystery dissolves into mathematics and engineering. If a human being can design a mind or rewrite a genome, then the divine nature of those things disappears. We are finding that the universe isn't a temple built by a master architect, but a vast, open-source project that we are finally learning how to read and write. The shrinking of God isn't just about losing an old explanation. It's about humanity finally stepping out of the shadow of its own myths and taking responsibility for the reality we inhabit. This ongoing retreat reveals a fundamental truth about the nature of faith versus the nature of evidence. Religion often demands that we stop questioning once we reach the edge of current human understanding, effectively placing a "keep out" sign on the door of the unknown. Science, however, sees that same door as an invitation. When we stop filling our gaps with ancient stories, we open up the possibility for genuine discovery. We shift from being a species that waits for revelations to a species that goes out and finds them. The transition from a God-centered universe to a human-centered understanding doesn't leave us in a cold or meaningless world. Instead, it puts the tools of progress directly into our hands. We no longer have to beg for mercy from the skies when we can build lightning rods, vaccines, and sustainable systems ourselves. In the end, as the gaps vanish, we aren't left with nothing. We are left with the truth, which is far more reliable and far more beautiful than any mystery we used to fear.